At the dinner table, my granddaughter told the guests, "She's from a time we don't really talk about." I passed the bread and left them choking on the rest. The silence followed me out the door. No one called after me. No one followed. Just shocked. Faces frozen around that mahogany table as I closed the front door behind me. My hands trembled with the car keys, 68 years old, and I still couldn't stop the tears stinging my eyes. A time we don't talk about. Like I was some embarrassing relic, a family secret better left buried. Through the rearview mirror, I caught my daughter's silhouette in the window. She wasn't coming after me. Of course not. The streetlights blurred as I drove. Not from tears. I refused to give them that satisfaction. But from anger building inside me. Elizabeth, my own granddaughter. 19 years old and parroting the family line about Grandma Margaret and her radical past. Memories washed over me. 1969. Vietnam War protests. Civil rights marches. Women's liberation. I wasn't just from that time. I had helped shape it. In our corner of Minnesota. My little house stood dark when I arrived. A refuge I'd built after Harold died. Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching. Away from my daughter Catherine's judgmental gaze. Away from the family that had slowly erased my history until I became just Grandma Margaret who makes good apple pie. Instead of Margaret Wilson, who once stood toe-to-toe with police at a women's rights rally. Inside, I headed straight for the hallway closet. My hands reached for the cardboard box I hadn't opened in years. Margaret, 60s and 70s, written in Harold's handwriting. The box was heavy with memories. Newspaper clippings yellowed with age. Protest buttons, pamphlets, and photographs. So many photographs. Me with my long brown hair and fierce eyes, fist raised at a rally. Me helping women register to vote. Me at the typewriter, working on the local chapter newsletter. My fingers found a particular newspaper clipping. Local women arrested at equal rights demonstration. The headline read, "There I was, chin up, being escorted away by police." 27 years old and unafraid. Catherine had been just 5 then. Harold had to explain why Mommy couldn't come home that night. Why some thought Mommy was a troublemaker. The phone rang. Catherine, probably, calling to chastise me for making a scene. I let it ring. "Mom?" Her voice came through the answering machine. "I hope you're not too upset about what Elizabeth said. You know how kids are. They don't understand the context of those times. Please call me back. The guests are asking about you." I almost laughed. The guests. Always more important than her mother's dignity. I looked down at a photo. Me standing proudly at the first women's health clinic in our town. The clinic where Catherine herself would later go, never acknowledging the battles fought to create. How had it come to this? When had my activism become something shameful? It started after Catherine married Richard. He came from a conservative family, ambitious and image-conscious. My past became inconvenient. First, it was, "Mom, maybe don't mention the protests at the country club dinner." Then it evolved to editing my history entirely. Eventually, my grandchildren grew up learning a sanitized version of who I was. I pulled out my diary from 1970, opening it to an entry from June. Today, I looked into my daughter's eyes and promised her we're fighting for a better world, one where she won't have to ask permission to have her own bank account, where her voice will matter as much as any man's, where she can choose her own path. The irony wasn't lost on me. Catherine had chosen to bury her mother's history to fit more comfortably into her upper-middle-class life. She'd taught her children that Grandma's activism was embarrassing, not a principled stand that helped pave the way for their own opportunities. Another photo caught my eye, me with Gloria Steinem during her visit to our state. I had been so proud that day, had felt so powerful. Now I was just, from a time we don't talk about. The phone rang again. I ignored it. Instead, I looked at a recent newspaper I'd saved. 1970s women's rights activists honored in new museum exhibit. I'd mentioned it to Catherine, who had just changed the subject. The answering machine clicked on again. "Margaret, it's Jean Winters." My heart skipped. Jean, my old friend from the movement. "I hope I'm not calling too late. I just read something that made me think of you. They're doing a documentary on the women's movement in the Midwest, focusing on local activists. Your name came up. Call me back when you can." I stared at the machine. Recognition, validation. Someone remembered what we did, what I did. I looked down at the scattered photographs of the young, fierce woman I had been. The woman who wouldn't have stood for being dismissed at her family's dinner table. The woman who had taught others to use their voices. My voice. When had I stopped using it? I picked up the phone and dialed Jean's number. When she answered, I said simply, "I think it's time people heard our story." "Margaret, I was hoping you'd call. They're particularly interested in your work with the clinic. It's considered groundbreaking now." "Groundbreaking," I repeated. The word felt like a warm blanket. "When do they want to start?" "They're interviewing. Next week. I'll tell them you're in." I thought of Catherine's face if she saw her mother speaking openly about those years. I thought of Elizabeth learning that her grandmother wasn't just from a time we don't talk about, but had helped create the freedoms she took for granted. "I'm in," I said, my voice stronger than it had been in years. When I hung up, I sat in my quiet kitchen surrounded by the evidence of a life my family had deemed too uncomfortable to acknowledge. I wouldn't force them to listen. But I wouldn't be silenced anymore either. Tomorrow would begin a new chapter. The Margaret Wilson who had passed the bread and walked away was gone. In her place stood a woman ready to reclaim her story. The morning after the dinner disaster, I woke with purpose. The box of memories still sat on my kitchen table, its contents spread out like evidence of a life my family wanted forgotten. As I made coffee, my answering machine blinked with 6 new messages. I pressed play while buttering my toast. "Mom, call me back. We need to talk about last night." "Margaret, it's Jean again. I told the documentary people you're interested. They're thrilled." "Mom, this is ridiculous. You can't just walk out on family dinner." "Grandma, it's Elizabeth. Mom told me to call you." I hit delete. Not ready for that conversation yet? The last message made me pause. "Margaret Wilson, this is Patricia Lang from Midwest Women's Stories Project. We'd love to interview you about your activism. Please call me back at." I jotted down the number before finishing my breakfast. This wasn't just about family drama anymore. This was about history, my history, and the countless women who had fought alongside me. After calling Patricia to arrange an interview for the following day, I decided to visit the university archives. If my family wouldn't acknowledge my past, perhaps others would. The campus had changed since I'd last visited. Modern buildings nestled alongside the older brick structures where I'd once attended consciousness-raising meetings. Students hurried past, young women with backpacks and ambitions, never knowing how recently those opportunities had been secured. The archivist, a woman about 40, brightened when I gave my name. "Margaret Wilson? The Margaret Wilson from the Women's Action Coalition? We have a whole collection on the WAC." She led me to a reading room and brought out boxes of materials, newsletters I'd helped write, photographs of demonstrations, minutes from our planning sessions for the health clinic. "These are incredible primary sources," she said, watching me leaf through them. "Most people don't realize how much of the movement happened at the local level, not just in New York and Washington." "My own family doesn't realize it," I murmured. She looked at me sympathetically. "That's not uncommon. I interview women activists from the 60s and 70s for our oral history project. Many say their families treat their activism as some youthful indiscretion rather than serious political work." I nodded, thinking of Catherine's dismissive mom's radical phase comments. "We're trying to correct that narrative," she continued. "Would you consider being interviewed for our collection?" 2 interview requests in one day, after decades of silence. "I would," I said, surprised by my own certainty. On my way home, I drove past Catherine's house. Her car was in the driveway. I could stop, try to explain. But what would I say? That her attempts to erase my past had hurt me for years? That I was tired of being treated like an embarrassing footnote in the family story? Instead, I kept driving. For once, I needed to put myself first. At home, I found Jean waiting on my porch. "I was in the neighborhood," she said, hugging me. Her silver hair was cut in the same short style she'd worn since the 70s, her eyes still bright behind round glasses. 40 years later and you're still a terrible liar," I laughed. Inside, we sat with tea, looking through the box of memories. "Together. Remember this march?" She held up a photo of us arm in arm, signs held high. "April 1970, I nodded. "Catherine had the flu. Harold stayed home with her." "He was one of the good ones," Jean said softly. "He was," I agreed. Harold had supported my activism, even when it made life complicated. After he died 10 years ago, something in me had dimmed, made it easier to accept my family's revisionist history. "So what happened last night?" Jean asked. I told her about Elizabeth's comment, about walking out. "Good for you," Jean said fiercely. It's about time. About time. Catherine will be furious about the documentary. Let her be, Jean shrugged. You spent decades being polite about their discomfort. Where did it get you? The phone rang. Catherine again. I let it go to voicemail. Mom, I don't understand why. You're being like this. Elizabeth feels terrible. She didn't mean anything by what she said. She's just repeating what she's heard. Please call me back. Jean raised an eyebrow. What she's heard. From whom, I wonder. My thoughts exactly. Elizabeth was just parroting the family narrative, the one her mother had created. After Jean left, I found myself drawn back to the diary from 1970. So many entries about Catherine, my hopes for her future, my desire to build a better world. For her. When had she decided that world was something to be ashamed of? I thought about what the archivist had said. My story wasn't just mine. It belonged to a movement, to history. By letting my family silence me, I was allowing them to erase not just my work, but the work of all the women who had stood beside me. That night, I didn't call Catherine back. Instead, I pulled out my old Nikon camera, the one I'd used to document protests, and checked if it still worked. Tomorrow, I would begin documenting again. My story, my truth. The documentary crew wanted to film in my house, surrounded by the evidence of my activism. As I prepared for their arrival, I found myself looking at my reflection, wondering if they would be disappointed. I wasn't the fiery young woman from those photographs anymore. But then I remembered something we used to say in the movement. The personal is political. My family's erasure of my history wasn't just a personal slight. It was part of a larger pattern of dismissing women's political work as unimportant or embarrassing. The doorbell rang promptly at 10. Patricia Lang stood there with two younger people carrying camera equipment. Margaret Wilson, she said warmly, it's an honor to meet you. Thank you for agreeing to tell your story. As I welcomed them in, I felt a strange sensation, like stepping into my younger self, the woman who had never been afraid to speak truth to power. Only this time, the power I needed to confront was much closer to home. We'll start with some basic questions about your involvement in the movement, Patricia explained as her team set up lights in my living room. Then we can move into specifics about the health clinic initiative. I nodded, smoothing my slacks nervously. The last time I'd been filmed was at a protest in 1972. The local news had painted us as hysterical troublemakers. Try to relax, Patricia said kindly. Just think of this as a conversation about important history that's been overlooked. Overlooked. Like the birthday cards I sent Elizabeth that never mentioned my activism. Like the sanitized stories I told at family gatherings to avoid making Richard uncomfortable. I had participated in my own erasure for too long. The camera light blinked on. Patricia sat across from me, poised and professional. Margaret Wilson, you were a founding member of the Women's Action Coalition in Marshall County during the late 1960s. What first drew you to the movement? The question unlocked something in me. Words I'd held back for years poured out. About inequality I'd witnessed as a young teacher, about discrimination in healthcare, about the awakening that happened when I first read The Feminine Mystique. We talked for hours. The clinic, the voter registration drives, the consciousness-raising groups in my living room, the arrests, the threats, the victories. You risked a lot, Patricia observed. Your reputation, your safety, even custody of your daughter at one point. I nodded, remembering the judge who'd questioned my fitness as a mother because of my radical activities. It wasn't without cost, I admitted, but we believed we were building a better future for our daughters. After the interview, Patricia showed me the release form. This will air on PBS next month, with segments potentially appearing online. We're calling it The Women Who Changed America, Grassroots Activism in the Heartland. I signed without hesitation. When the crew left, exhaustion hit me. Not just from the interview, but from decades of holding these stories inside. My answering machine blinked again. 3 new messages, all from Catherine. I sighed and pressed play. Mom, please call me back. Dad and I are worried about you. Mom, Aunt Carol said. She saw camera equipment being unloaded at your house. What's going on? Mom, Elizabeth is coming home from college this weekend. We'd like to have dinner on Sunday. Please come. We need to talk. I deleted the messages. If Catherine wanted to talk, she could come to me. That evening, my doorbell rang. I expected Jean, but found Catherine standing there instead, her expression a mixture of concern and irritation. You couldn't return my calls? She asked, brushing past me into the house. I needed some time. She stopped short at the sight of my living room. The box of memorabilia was still open, photographs and newspaper clippings scattered across the coffee table. "What is all this?" she asked, though she knew perfectly well. "My life," I said simply. "The part you prefer not to discuss." Catherine sighed, running a hand through her hair. "So like mine once before it turned silver." "Mom, I don't understand why you're being so dramatic." Elizabeth made one comment. A comment she learned from you. Her cheeks flushed. "That's not fair, isn't it? When was the last time you spoke about my work with pride? When did you start treating it like some embarrassing secret? You know Richard's family is conservative." "Richard's family? It's been 25 years, Catherine. This isn't about Richard's family. It's about you being ashamed of me." She looked away. "I'm not ashamed. It's just complicated." "What's complicated about fighting for women's rights?" "You were arrested, Mom. You chained yourself to buildings. You were called a radical, a troublemaker." "Yes," I nodded. "And because women like me were willing to be troublemakers, you got to have a credit card in your own name. You got to have legal protection from workplace harassment. You got to control your own reproductive choices." Catherine stared at a photograph of me being led away by police. "I remember this day," she said quietly. "Dad made mac and cheese for dinner, and I cried when you weren't home to tuck me in." For a moment, I saw it from her perspective, the confused child whose mother was suddenly gone, villainized on the evening news. "I'm sorry for the difficult moments," I said gently, "but I'm not sorry for fighting for what was right." She picked up another photo, me with a group of women outside the newly opened health clinic. "You never talk about these days, because you made it clear you didn't want to hear about them." She looked at me sharply. "That's not true. Catherine, you've been editing me out of existence for years, making me smaller, quieter, less controversial." My voice cracked. "Do you have any idea how that feels?" She sat down heavily on the couch. "I never thought of it that way." We sat in silence for a moment. "What were those camera people doing here?" she finally asked. "I'm being interviewed for a documentary about women activists in the Midwest." Her eyes widened. "A documentary? Mom, why didn't you tell me? Would you have approved?" The question hung between us. She didn't answer, which was answer enough. "It's important, Catherine. Not just for me, but for all the women who worked alongside me. Our stories matter. And what about our family? Does privacy not matter?" "I'm not exposing family secrets. I'm discussing my political work that helped shape history." Catherine looked around at the evidence of my past life scattered about the room. "Elizabeth is coming home this weekend. What am I supposed to tell her about why you walked out?" Why not tell her the truth? That her grandmother was hurt by being described as someone from a time not worth talking about. She winced. She didn't mean it like that, didn't she? Or was she just repeating what she's learned from you and Richard? Catherine stood up abruptly. "I should go. Will you come to dinner on Sunday?" I thought about it. "Yes, but Catherine, I won't be hiding who I am anymore." After she left, I called. "Jean, how did the interview go?" she asked. "Better than the one with my daughter that followed it." Jean laughed. "Catherine finally tracked you down? What did she say about the documentary?" "She's worried about the family's privacy." "Of course she is." Jean sighed. "Heaven forbid anyone know her mother was on the right side of history." We talked a while longer. Then I hung up and went to bed. As I drifted off to sleep, I thought about Sunday's dinner. What would I say to Elizabeth? How would I begin to reclaim my story with my own granddaughter? Whatever happened, I knew one thing for certain. I would never pass the bread in silence, again. Sunday arrived with a pit in my stomach. I hadn't been back to Catherine's house since walking out 4 days ago. As I dressed, I chose my silver pendant, a women's symbol I'd worn to rallies decades ago. The drive to Catherine's suburban home felt long. How many dinners had I sat through, biting my tongue as Richard pontificated about politics? How many times had I smiled tightly when someone made a comment about those crazy feminists? Catherine opened the door before I could knock. "You came," she said, relief evident. I said I would. She glanced at my pendant but said nothing. Richard stood in the kitchen drinking scotch. "Margaret?" He nodded. "Richard." I matched his tone. Catherine busied herself with dinner preparations while Richard retreated to watch television. I offered to help in the kitchen. "Mom," Catherine spoke quietly, "please don't bring up the documentary today." Elizabeth feels bad enough. I won't start an argument, but I won't pretend anymore. She sighed. "Why does everything have to be a political statement with you?" Existing as my authentic self isn't political. It's just living. Elizabeth arrived, soon after, looking hesitant when she saw me. "Hi, Grandma," she said carefully. "Hello, Elizabeth." I didn't rush to smooth things over. Dinner was awkward. Richard dominated the conversation with golf stories. Catherine asked Elizabeth about classes. I ate quietly, waiting. During dessert, Elizabeth looked at me. "Grandma, I'm sorry about what I said. I didn't mean to upset you. What exactly did you think you were saying?" I asked gently. She glanced at her mother. That's how Mom always refers to when you were involved in all that political stuff. All that political stuff, I repeated. "You mean the women's movement? The fight for equal rights?" Catherine tensed. "Mom, no, Catherine. I want to hear what Elizabeth thinks." I turned to my granddaughter. "Do you know what all that political stuff actually was?" Elizabeth shifted. "You were like a protester? For women's lib?" "Women's liberation, yes. Did you know I helped establish the first women's health clinic in this county? The same clinic you visited when you were 17? Her eyes widened. "That was you?" "Me and dozens of other women who were tired of being second-class citizens. The time we don't talk about shaped the world you live in now." Richard cleared his throat. "This isn't dinner conversation, Margaret." "Why not?" I asked. "We discuss your business deals. We talk about Elizabeth's classes. Why is my life work off limits?" "Because it's divisive," Catherine cut in. "What people can't handle the truth? Your country club friends? Richard's golf partners? Or just this family?" Elizabeth watched me. "What else did you do, Grandma?" Before Catherine could interrupt, I answered. "I organized voter registration drives. I lobbied for equal pay legislation. I was arrested 3 times for civil disobedience." "Arrested?" Elizabeth's eyes were wide. "Your grandmother exaggerates," Richard said dismissively. "No, I don't." I pulled out the newspaper clipping, me being led away in handcuffs. April 12th, 1970, protesting discriminatory hiring practices at Marshall County Bank. Elizabeth took the clipping. "You looked so badass." "Elizabeth?" Catherine admonished. "Well, she did," Elizabeth insisted. "Why didn't I know any of this?" Silence fell. Richard stared at his plate. Catherine fidgeted with her napkin. "Because," I said quietly, "in this family, my activism has been treated as something shameful." "That's not true," Catherine protested weakly. "Isn't it? When was the last time you acknowledged this part of my life without cringing?" Elizabeth looked between us. "Is that why you left the other night?" I nodded. Being referred to as "from a time we don't talk about" was the last straw after years of having my history erased. "I didn't know," Elizabeth said. "Mom never really told me except that you were involved in politics." I glanced at Catherine, whose face had paled. "There's a lot you don't know, but that's going to change." "What do you mean?" Catherine asked sharply. "I've been interviewed for a documentary about the women's movement. It will air next month on PBS." Richard put down his fork. "You did what?" "Mom, we talked about this," Catherine said tightly. "No, you talked." I decided. I turned to Elizabeth. "Your generation deserves to know what we fought for. These rights you take for granted. They're still fragile." Elizabeth leaned forward. "Can I see it when it comes out?" "Elizabeth," Catherine warned. "What?" "It's history. My history, too." Elizabeth turned back to me. "Actually, I'm doing a paper on second-wave feminism for my women's studies class. Could I interview you?" Catherine's face showed shock. Richard pushed back from the table. "I'll check the game," he muttered, escaping. Catherine stood. "I'll make coffee," she said, disappearing. Left alone with my granddaughter, I felt hope. "I'd be happy to help with your paper," I told her. "There's a whole box of primary sources at my house." "Really? That would be amazing." Elizabeth hesitated. "I'm sorry about what I said. I had no idea it was your life's work. Not your fault. You can't know what's been kept from you." In the kitchen, I heard Catherine slamming cabinets. I'd have to face her before the evening ended, but for now, this moment with Elizabeth felt like a victory. For the first time in years, I was being seen, really seen, by a member of my own family. The week after the Sunday dinner passed in a whirlwind. Elizabeth called twice to arrange a time to come over for her interview. Catherine didn't call at all. Jean stopped by with news that more women from our old coalition had agreed to participate in the documentary. "They're calling it a landmark project now," she said, sipping tea at my kitchen table. Some big historian from the university is involved. I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt a strange melancholy. Why had it taken walking out of a dinner party at 68 to finally stand up for myself? Saturday morning, Elizabeth arrived promptly at 10, notebook and recorder in hand. She looked around my modest living room with new interest, noticing the framed photographs I'd recently put back on display. "I brought bagels," she said, placing a paper bag on the coffee table. "And I have like a million questions." I smiled. "Where do you want to start?" She settled on the couch, surprisingly professional. "The beginning, I guess. When did you first get involved in the movement?" For the next 2 hours, I told her everything. My gradual awakening in the late 60s, the consciousness raising, groups, the protests, the clinic, the arrests. She took notes furiously, occasionally stopping to ask thoughtful questions. "Weren't you scared?" she asked when I described being threatened for helping women register to vote. "Terrified," I admitted. "But there's something powerful about standing with other women. Fear doesn't disappear, but it becomes manageable." She nodded, writing that down. "And Grandpa Harold, he supported you?" "He did. Not every husband would have. Some women lost their marriages over their activism." "Is that why Mom never talks about this? Was she embarrassed by it?" I chose my words carefully. "Your mother was very young. She remembers the disruption, the late nights, the phone calls, the criticism from neighbors. She didn't understand the purpose behind it. But later, when she grew up," I sighed. "By then, she'd learned to see my activism as something problematic, something that made her different from her friends' mothers." Elizabeth looked thoughtful. "And when she married Dad, that sealed it. Richard comes from a very different world. His family valued tradition, conformity. So Mom just erased part of who you are to make Dad's family comfortable? And herself," I added gently. "It was easier for everyone if Grandma Margaret was just a retired teacher who baked good pies, not someone who challenged the status quo." Elizabeth looked troubled. "That's messed up." The doorbell rang before I could respond. Through the window, I saw Catherine's car in the driveway. "That's your mother," I said, standing. "I wasn't expecting her." Elizabeth looked panicked. "She doesn't know I'm here. I told her I was studying at the library." "It's fine," I assured her, though my heart was racing as I opened the door. Catherine stood on the porch, her expression a mix of frustration and exhaustion. "Mom, we need to..." She stopped abruptly when she spotted Elizabeth on the couch. "What are you doing here?" Elizabeth straightened. "Interviewing Grandma for my paper, like I said I would." Catherine's lips thinned. "You told me you were going to the library." "I was going to go there afterward," Elizabeth said, not quite meeting her mother's eyes. Catherine turned to me. "You should have called me." "Why?" I asked simply. "Elizabeth is an adult. She wanted to learn about her grandmother's life. What's the problem?" "The problem," Catherine said tightly, "is that she's being manipulated into taking sides in whatever crusade you're on." "Mom!" Elizabeth protested. "No one's manipulating me. This is for school." Catherine ignored her, eyes fixed on me. "First the documentary, now this. It's like you're deliberately trying to undermine my relationship with my daughter." "That's not fair," I said, keeping my voice calm. Elizabeth came to me. She wants to know her history, our history. "Our history," Catherine repeated bitterly. "You mean your version of it, as opposed to the sanitized version you've been sharing? The one where your mother's contributions to history don't exist?" Elizabeth stood up. "Mom, please don't do this. I just wanted to understand." "Understand what?" Catherine snapped. "How your grandmother prioritized politics over her family? How she left a 5-year-old at home while she got herself arrested?" The room fell silent. Elizabeth looked stunned. I felt the old wound reopen, the guilt that had haunted me for decades. "Is that what you remember?" I asked softly. "The times I wasn't there? What else should I remember?" Catherine's voice cracked. "The phone calls in the middle of the night? The whispers from other mothers at school about my radical mom? Do you have any idea what that was like for a child?" I hadn't expected this, not the raw pain in her voice, the years of hurt bubbling to the surface. "Catherine," I began. "No," she cut me off. "You don't get to rewrite history now. You chose your causes over your daughter. That's the truth." Elizabeth looked between us, confused. "Mom, That's not what Grandma was saying at all. You weren't there, Catherine said flatly. Neither were you, I countered. Not for the full picture. Yes. There were times I wasn't home when I should have been. Times you felt the consequences of my choices. I've always regretted that. Catherine looked away. But, I continued, I was fighting for a future where you could have choices I never had. Where you wouldn't be defined solely as someone's wife or mother. Where you could have a career, a voice, control over your own body. I never asked for that, Catherine said. You didn't have to ask. It was your birthright. And now, it's Elizabeth's. I looked at my granddaughter, seeing the confusion on her face. The rights your generation takes for granted. They were won by women who took risks, who sometimes made painful sacrifices. Catherine sank into a chair, suddenly looking exhausted. You always make it sound so noble, but it wasn't noble to a kid who just wanted her mom home for dinner. The three of us sat in silence for a moment, generations of women connected by blood, but separated by experience. Finally, Elizabeth spoke. I want to understand both sides. I want to know what it was like for you too, Mom. Catherine looked up, surprised. Maybe, Elizabeth continued hesitantly. This paper could include both perspectives. What the movement meant to the women involved and what it meant to their families? I felt a surge of pride in my granddaughter's wisdom. That would make a more complete picture, I agreed. Catherine didn't respond immediately. When she did, her voice was quiet. There's a box in our attic, my childhood journals and schoolwork. Some of it mentions that time. Elizabeth's eyes lit up. Could I see them? Catherine nodded slowly. I suppose it's time someone did. As they prepared to leave, Catherine paused at the door. The documentary, she said, not quite looking at me. When did you say it airs? May 15th, PBS. She nodded. I might watch it, to understand what was so important to you. It wasn't forgiveness, it wasn't even acceptance, but it was a start. The morning of May 15th dawned bright and clear. I woke early, too nervous to sleep. After weeks of editing and re-interviews, the documentary would air tonight. Unsung Heroes. Women who changed America's heartland had evolved from a small local project into a feature-length PBS special, Jean called Just After 9. Are you ready for your television debut? Hardly, I laughed. I keep thinking about all the things I should have said differently. Too late now, she said cheerfully. By the way, Helen's hosting a viewing party at her house. Most of the old gang will be there. I hesitated. I'm not sure yet. I might watch it alone. The truth was I'd been hoping Catherine might call. We hadn't spoken much since that day in my living room, though Elizabeth had visited twice more for her paper. Each time, she'd brought small updates. Mom found more of her old school essays, or Mom mentioned something about your protest signs. Tiny. Olive branches too fragile to grasp too firmly. The day passed slowly. I cleaned my already clean house. I baked bread I didn't need. I rearranged my bookshelf. By 6 o'clock, I had run out of distractions. The phone rang at 6:30. Catherine. Mom? Her voice sounded tentative. Is your invitation still open to watch together? Richard is at a business dinner, and I thought, maybe Elizabeth and I could. Come over. I gripped the phone tighter. Yes, of course. I'd like that. We'll bring pizza, she said, and hung up before I could respond. I hurried around, picking up newspapers, fluffing pillows. At 7:15, the doorbell rang. Catherine stood there holding a pizza box, Elizabeth beside her with a bottle of wine. Come in, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We settled in the living room, plates balanced on our laps. The conversation was stilted at first, Catherine commenting on my new curtains, Elizabeth chattering about finals. We carefully avoided any mention of why we were really there. At 8:00 sharp, I turned on the television. The PBS logo appeared, then the documentary title. I felt my heart race as the narrator began. In small towns across America's heartland, a quiet revolution was taking place. Old photographs filled the screen. Women marching, protesting, organizing. Then my face appeared, looking straight into the camera. We weren't trying to be revolutionary, my recorded voice said. We were just trying to be human, to be counted, to matter. Beside me on the couch, Catherine shifted slightly. The documentary moved chronologically, tracing the movement from its early days through its major victories. About 20 minutes in, the focus turned to local health initiatives. In Marshall County, a group of determined women fought to establish the region's first women's health clinic. the narrator explained. Among them was teacher and mother Margaret Wilson. There I was again, sitting in my living room surrounded by my memorabilia. The healthcare system wasn't designed with women in mind, I explained on screen. We needed a place where women could receive care that respected their autonomy, their dignity. The camera panned to a photo of the clinic opening, me cutting the ribbon, looking proud and determined, then to a series of newspaper clippings about the controversy it caused. "Did you keep any of these?" Elizabeth asked, breaking the silence in the living room. "Most of them," I admitted. "They're in that box you looked through." Catherine's eyes remained fixed on the screen. The documentary continued, covering the legal challenges, the community backlash, and finally, the clinic's success. Then came the part I'd been dreading. Footage of my arrest at the bank protest. The grainy black and white video showed me being led away in handcuffs, head held high. I knew I might not be home for dinner, my on-screen self said solemnly. I knew my daughter might not understand, but I believed I was building a better world for her, even if it meant sacrificing moments of her childhood. Catherine inhaled sharply. On screen, I continued. That's the hardest part that no one talks about. The guilt. Wondering if you're doing the right thing, if the future you're fighting for is worth the present you're missing. I still don't have a perfect answer for that. The room fell silent again. I couldn't look at Catherine. The documentary moved on to other women, other stories. When it ended 90 minutes later, Elizabeth was the first to speak. "That was amazing, Grandma. You were amazing." I smiled weakly, still watching Catherine. From the corner of my eye, she sat perfectly still, her pizza barely touched. "I'll clear the plates," Elizabeth said, clearly sensing the tension. She disappeared into the kitchen, leaving us alone. After what felt like an eternity, Catherine spoke. "You never told me about the guilt." I turned to face her. "Would it have mattered?" "Yes," she said quietly. "It would have helped me understand. You weren't choosing the movement over me. That it was. More complicated than that. It was the hardest choice I ever made," I admitted. "Every time I missed a school event or came home late, I questioned everything." Catherine nodded slowly. "In my journals, the ones I showed Elizabeth, I wrote about being proud of you once. When my teacher asked what our parents did, and I said my mother fought for women's rights, some of the kids thought it was cool. You never told me that." "I forgot," she said. "Or maybe I chose to forget the good parts. It was easier to remember the disappointments." We sat in silence again, decades of misunderstanding between us. "I think I understand now," Catherine finally said. "Not completely, but I'm trying. When I saw you on screen tonight, you weren't just my mother who wasn't there sometimes. You were part of something important." Tears pricked my eyes. "That means more than you know," Elizabeth returned, hovering uncertainly in the doorway. "I got an A on my paper," she announced. The professor said it was one of the most nuanced explorations of second-wave feminism he'd read from an undergraduate. "Of course you did," Catherine said with unexpected warmth. "You had primary sources no one else had access to." "Two primary sources," Elizabeth corrected, looking between us. "Two different perspectives on the same history." Catherine stood up, gathering her purse. "We should get going. It's getting late." At the door, she paused. "Mom, some of my friends at the community college are organizing a women's history event next month. They're looking for speakers. Would you?" "I'd be honored," I said, trying not to show how much this simple invitation meant. After they left, I sat alone in my quiet house, replaying the evening in my mind. It wasn't a fairy tale reconciliation. Catherine hadn't suddenly embraced my entire past or apologized for years of erasure, but she had taken a step toward seeing me, the full me, not just the sanitized version that fit neatly into her world. As I got ready for bed, the phone rang. Jean, wanting to know how the documentary had been received. "Catherine and Elizabeth watched it with me," I told her. And we're talking. Really talking. Maybe for the first time. After we hung up, I stood by the window, looking out at the quiet street. The young woman who had once been arrested fighting for a better world was still here, inside this older body. She hadn't been erased after all. The next family dinner would be different. I wouldn't pass the bread in silence anymore. None of us would. None of us would.